Hi, FutureCon. It's great to be with you here today. Thank you so much for joining me. We're going to chat a little bit about ransom attacks, something that's top of mind for everyone today in security. And we'll look at the history, where we are today, and then glance forward to where we may be going, where these attacks may evolve in the future. Now, maybe it shouldn't be a surprise that we're seeing digital systems and data held for ransom, because throughout history, we've seen things of value be ransomed. In fact, the largest ransom payment ever takes us all the way back to the Crusades. King Richard the Lionheart of England was traveling home from the Crusades. He was shipwrecked near Venice, which is hostile territory, went ashore with his party and tried his best to blend in as a merchant. Unfortunately for him, he was 6'5" tall. He had orange hair, had a big party, who spent a lot of money. So he didn't stay hidden long. He was found. He was turned over to Henry VI, who then held him hostage for almost 2 years until England came up with a ransom of 150,000 marks, which is the equivalent of $3.3 billion in today's currency. Things of value are ransomed. And it didn't take long from the beginning of the PC era to see someone figure this out and say, hey, these systems are valuable, and maybe I can get some money by locking them. A man named Joseph Popp mailed 20,000 floppy disks to hospitals in the US, claiming to have AIDS research. And in reality, it was a Trojan that locked the systems and said, you need to send me a payment of $189 to this PO box in Panama. Unfortunately for Joseph, fortunately for all of the hospitals, this was built on symmetric key encryption. And so the key to decrypt was actually in the software. Some security researchers pretty quickly found that. They published the key, and the impact of the attack was blunted, and Joseph was caught and sentenced. But the idea was out there now. And it went away for a while. We didn't really see any sort of ransom attacks, but then we saw it come back in what I'll say are three distinct phases. So the first was in the early 2000s, we saw scareware. And this was really the more benign version of things. It was tricking people into sending money by scaring them. And it was an evolution of the world of spam into a new business model. That became much more malevolent in the 2010s with ransomware, where the systems really were locked. The data really was encrypted. And so there was a much, much stronger motivation for the victim to pay. This evolved again in 2020 into ransom ops. And this is a new class of attacks. The end game is the same, which is to get a ransom and get someone to pay money to have their data unencrypted. It's a very, very different type of attack. And it's important, this isn't just semantics. It's important to understand these differences so you think about how to defend against this class of attacks. So let's look at each of these in a bit more detail, starting with scareware. And you may have seen screens like this, but they're basically popping up and saying, hey, you have 13 infections, 49 infections, and if you send me money or give this number a call where they'll tell you to send money, we'll clean it all up for you. There were other variants of this. For example, there's one that popped open the CD-ROM drive and said, hey, if your CD-ROM just popped open, it means you have a real problem and you should send me 50 bucks. And all of these types of campaigns were run by people like Sanford Wallace. In fact, the CD-ROM drive popping open was one of his campaigns. He had been in the world of spam. He was known as the Spam King, and had evolved his business model into the scareware spyware. Like Sanford, these scareware was run by what were unsophisticated organizations based primarily in the US. They took credit card payments, and so when it became an issue, this was something that was relatively straightforward to shut down. There's a legal response. The attorneys general from the states and at the federal level in the US came together. They filed a bunch of suits. They went to the credit card processors, got them to stop processing payments for these organizations, effectively it was litigated out of business. This whole class of attack in 2006, 2007, it basically vanished. So it went away for a couple of years, but then in the early 2010s, it came back in a more malevolent form, where people realized, hey, you could scare people into sending the money. What if you actually force them to, because you do something much worse, which is encrypt their data, lock their systems so that they truly can't use them? And so we saw variants like Reviton and CryptoLocker come out that did just this. And the other innovation here was use of Bitcoin for payment rather than credit card processors, which made it much harder to track. And so it started going after single systems and the network drives that were attached to those systems. It then evolved within the ransomware category to say, okay, if it's bad for one system, what if we could spread across the network? Let's go back and combine ransomware with worm technology, and the most common early on was to use the eternal blue vulnerability to be able to spread. WannaCry, NotPetya became absolutely household names. Did a ton of damage by doing this ransomware approach with combined with worming to just blast across networks very fast with automated spread. And the key thing that ties these together, whether it was single system or the worm plus that spread across networks, it was all about the payload. It was about the ransomware. And I think Carbon Black does a great job in summarizing this. I lifted this slide from a few years ago, or this visual from a few years ago, and it looks at what happens. And it's basically, okay, the ransomware is the payload that's delivered at the beginning of it all. It makes it through your spam filters, your AV filters, your secure web gateways, your AV on the system, and bam, it compromises the system. It does its thing in order to automatically encrypt data, and then in the case of the multi-system variants, to spread itself. So the worm kicks off and it scans the network, looks for things that have SMB and the eternal blue exposure, or whatever technique they're using, and it does it. But it is all about the malware. It's all about the ransomware. This was incredibly successful. It did damage to organizations. It was measured in the billions of dollars. And it was a very different beast to try to get a hold of and get our arms around, because no longer was it the Stanford Wallaces of the world who were running this. It was organized crime. It was nation states, and typically done from jurisdictions that, especially Western legal systems, couldn't reach. And so there wasn't a whole lot of avenue to shut this down in the way that the scareware had been. The other piece that made it much more difficult is Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies were used for payments. So there was no longer this choke point in going after the credit card processors and in shutting off the pipe of money. And so this did massive damage, a lot of headlines, a lot of disruption, and then it started to fade. The payload innovation slowed down, and now, because it was all focused on the malware or the ransomware, you had better detection, and it would find these things, and largely it stopped in this form. So that's the good news. The bad news was the payload innovation had stopped because the criminal organizations involved had moved on, and they had moved on to RansomOps. And this is fundamentally different. And it's important to understand what is different. There's an element of this which is about the business model. And so there is ransomware as a service, use of affiliates in order to scale the attacks. All of that is an important part. But I'd like to focus specifically on the technology side and look at what is technically different and what that means for us as defenders. Now, RansomOps, full disclosure, not my term. This comes from Anton Chuvakin. I saw his tweet, or this is how I came across it, was Anton's tweet. Anton is formerly Gartner, currently at Google, and he references Sam Curry from Cybereason as the original namer of this. I think it's a great term that very, very succinctly captures what's going on. And so RansomOps, it is. Now, what does it mean? If you look at a RansomOps attack, it is very much like any attack. It starts with probing the DMZ and typically looking for ways to get in. Could be by attacking a web app in the DMZ. It could be going after a remote access gateway, finding a vulnerability in the VPN. It could be phishing a user and getting a credential for the VPN or a credential for Azure AD that then allows you to pivot back into the network and take control of physical systems. So the normal ways in is the start of the attack. And once access is gained, it's very typical tools that are used. So it's standard C2 implants. There's a lot of Cobalt Strike that gets used in these attacks. And then with the toehold of the network, with the ability to control those systems, then it's the recon phase. And it's looking for trying to map the network. It's looking for where there is good data, where that data that people will pay for is. It's looking for credentials, trying to find a way to escalate privileges and move to domain admin on the domain controller. So very, very standard techniques for moving along, a lot of live off the land. All of this looks like any other attack. There is no ransomware here. The ransomware payload wasn't at the beginning. This is all standard attack TTPs that you'd see in any sort of a modern attack. After you have the data has been found and gathered, then you'll see exfil. And so this is the first, of the two-phase. How do I get people to pay? The data is exfilled. Again, this is actually using standard techniques to get the data out of the environment. Then and only then does the ransomware enter. So it is the very end game where ransomware comes into this picture. And now, since it's not worming, it's not finding all of these other ways to move that can actually take some time, especially in a somewhat patched environment. Now it's typically attackers sitting on the domain controller with domain admin, and they blast the ransomware across the environment so quickly to encrypt, lock the data, that by the time you see the ransomware, it's really too late. And so this is why it is so fundamentally different, why it is so important to distinguish between a ransomware attack and a RansomOps attack. RansomOps needs to be stopped before it's left of exfil, before the exfil happens, in order to save the business from substantial damage. If you see the ransomware, it's too late. So what are the three big ways where RansomOps is fundamentally different? The first is in control. In a ransomware attack, all of the intelligence, all of what's going to happen in the attack is coded into the ransomware, into the actual payload, the malware that's running. It has the intelligence. And so that means while it can move very fast, it is predictable. It's going to do the same thing everywhere. In a RansomOps attack, it's controlled by humans. And so that means it's going to be more adaptive. It's going to find any weaknesses, any vulnerabilities, and it's going to be much, much less predictable. It's going to look a little bit different in every environment. It's going to look a little bit different with any attacker who's driving it, because it's going to be based on their skills, their knowledge, their comfort. The second thing that is so fundamentally different is in how it moves laterally, how it moves and spreads through the environment. With ransomware, it was very much focused on exploits. So whether it was Eternal Blue or other types, this was the primary mechanism to move and spread. RansomOps is focused much more on credentials and live off the land techniques. So it's a very, very different flavor. And there's a critical consequence. You're not going to patch your way out of this. Is patching good? Yes, some of the remote access vulnerabilities, DMZ, web server attacks, if you can patch or secure, it makes it harder for them to get in. But once they're in, there's no patching that's going to slow down the attack or substantially slow down the attack. The third element that is so fundamentally different is really the role of the malware itself. And in the case of the ransomware attacks, it is the malware. It is about the actual where and start to finish. It's the thing that gets delivered onto the initial system. It's the thing that does the encryption. It's the thing that moves laterally. You need to focus on preventing and finding and stopping the ransomware. And the RansomOps attack, it's completely different. The ransomware is the end game only. And by the time you see it, it's too late to actually prevent the substantial damage that it comes. You have to find it left of seeing the actual ransomware. So fundamentally different in those three ways: the control of the lateral movement and the role that the actual malware plays in it. So now let's look at a study of this in real life. And this is one of Vectra's customers, and they had a ransomware gang come after them, and so this is above is what the attackers were doing, below is what Vectra detected, and the signal that was provided to help them stop the attack. And all of this that you'll see is left of exfil. So it started with external recon, and this was quite lengthy. It was almost a week where they were probing. They were looking for ways in. So the focus was on VPNs. It was on FTP servers. It was on webmail, and all of this was coming from a set of Russian IPs, and all of the data, all of the probing, all of the scanning was visible in IR using network metadata. So after probing, the attackers identified that there was a Sonic Wall VPN that had a vulnerability that was not patched. And that vulnerability allowed for a user credential to be stolen, which the attackers then used to log in via the VPN. As soon as they hit the network, they started moving fast. Time is money. This is a business. They're trying to move as quickly as possible to get the ransom to the situation where they can demand the ransom. And so they started doing a bunch of scanning using various tools. We saw Mimikatz, NetScan was running. There was also some lookups that happened back to Russian search engines, most likely looking for information about the systems that they were running into, vulnerabilities that they might be able to take advantage of. The DNS infrastructure, all these queries were coming to the corporate DNS, so it was all the information was available. Within 2 minutes of the attackers getting onto the network, Vectra had detected them and elevated that source host to critical. There's all of this information was just making the system light up like a Christmas tree, looking at port sweeps, looking at different types of RPC recon that was part of searching for credentials and how to run a credential attack, enumerating file shares, looking for different types of data, potentially looking for credentials buried in different scripts or whatnot as well. And so at this point, the attack could have been stopped through automated response. Those systems could have been isolated automatically. However, this organization had chosen to have people involved when it was non-critical assets. And this attack happened in the middle of the night. And so there were no people staring at dashboards. And the attack was able to progress. There were a bunch more detections that came up, both the types that had already been seen got stronger and stronger in their signal, but there were new types that came in as well. After about 6 hours of this active scanning and moving and looking for credentials and data, the attackers must have believed that they had enough information to get to domain admin, and so they then queried the domain controller, and they asked some questions about group membership, looking to understand the structure of groups and make sure that they knew their path to domain admin. And there's then an offline analysis period where there's no activity. 16 minutes later, they RDP'd to 2 of the domain controllers, and so they had, in fact, had enough information to gain access to domain admin on the domain controllers. So they RDP'd to those, and that flagged a couple more detections. One related to the queries that had been run against the domain controller. The other for the use of RDP. In this case, it was a Cyrillic keyboard that was being used, which was unusual for the credential or the client token that was used, as well as the server, the domain controller that was being accessed, as well as for the environment. So it was a pretty clear signal that something was wrong. And so that was another detection. Now they were on the domain controller, they had domain admin, they started their final phase of prep and did some more scanning and sweeping. And at that point, they were shut down. Those detections drove the domain controller to critical. There was automated response configured. In this case, it was isolating via Sentinel-1 as the EDR. It could have been any of the leading EDRs, but in this case, it was Sentinel-1. And the account was disabled as well, the account that was being used to move laterally. So the attack was paused. They then called Vectra in. We helped with the incident response. This attack was stopped, and the attackers were not able to regain access into this network. All of this was left of exfil. It was left of the ransomware. So the interesting thing is that means the attribution is not 100% because you can see the ransomware. However, based on all of the indicators, things like use of sonic wall as the entry point, the source IPs lined up with infrastructure associated with this gang, we believe with confidence this was UNC 2447. That's the Mandiant group label for it, which uses and deploys the Fivehands ransomware. So an attack stopped left of exfil. Now, RansomOps is not going to look the same everywhere. There are different affiliates that use different tools, techniques. They're going to adjust based on what's available in your environment. And so just kind of showing this, if you look at the orange, that is the things that were used uniquely in the attack that we just looked at. I've labeled in blue a second attack and things that were unique to that attack. And you'll see things like in that one, there was a threat intel match. In that one, the second case that we saw in a customer environment, they used command and control. So they were using, it turned out, I think it was a Cobalt Strike, but they were using some different ways to control versus coming in over the VPN. There was a very heavy focus and use of Kerberos credentials. And so there were a set of privilege access anomalies that flagged as those credentials were used. And then the purple are things that were common to both. So there were a set of techniques that were used in both attacks. So the macro point is there are plenty of signals to look for, but you have to have a breadth of coverage for the techniques that are in use. These things aren't all the same. You really need to have a breadth of coverage across common tactics in order to be able to successfully see the variety and stop the variety of attacks that are out there. Okay, so that's RansomOps. That's where we are today, and these are some of the techniques that you can use to stop. If we look to where this may be going, history often gives us a sense of and early indicators of where technology and where things are headed. Back all the way in 2014 or 2015, there's an attack against an organization called CodeSpaces. And CodeSpaces was a source code repository. They were run or they were hosted in AWS. They had their cloud infrastructure in AWS, and they were victim of a DDoS attack. In the course of that DDoS attack, the attackers also gained access to their cloud admin console. And Codespaces decided they weren't going to pay. They were extorted to, to turn off the DDoS attack. They said, no, we're not going to pay. And they also determined during their response that the attackers did have access into their cloud console, and so they started trying to evict them. At which point the attackers basically went for the nuclear option, and they wiped everything out from the cloud control plane. They were able to just wipe out everything, to the point that that the company could not recover. There was just no technical way that they could recover. They had lost everything for all of their customers, and so they were forced to cease operations. Now, there hasn't been a ton of additional cloud native attacks since, but when you go back to threat, or the idea that throughout history we ransom things of value, there's a ton of value in the cloud, whether it's through AWS, Azure, collaboration apps like Microsoft 365 or G Suite. It's clear that ransom will move to that at some point in order to effectively go after the things that have value. So takeaways. One, ransomware has become ransom ops. It's important for us to be able to see these attacks and stop these attacks left of exfil. That means having, the good news, the signal is there. There's lots and lots of ability to see them before the damage is done. And the key is having very broad coverage for attack techniques. And then as we think about how this is likely to evolve, it's the next step for many of these ransomware gangs is likely into the cloud. There's a lot of value there. And so as we consider our security postures and how we plan for security, it's going to become increasingly important to have the same types of capabilities for all of our cloud assets, whether that's your key SaaS apps and collaboration apps, whether it's your cloud infrastructures. So ransomware has become ransom ops. Stopping left of exfil is possible if you look for the right things in the right places, and cloud is a likely next step for ransomware gangs. So thank you for your time today. I appreciate it. I'll be back in our virtual booth if you'd like to chat more, hear more detail about anything that we've talked about today. Would love to hear from you. So thank you very much. Have a great day.